interesting. I was telling a few people that my very first job out of college, I worked in the nursing home at the North End, and there was a feature in the Globe, and they came and they interviewed a number of the residents there who had lived through it. So it was really interesting then, and here we are 30 or so years later. Thanks, John.
You're welcome. Thank you. Well, thank you for coming out, everyone. I hope you all had a nice holiday and enjoying the nice summer, or not summer, but it seems like summer almost, right? Spring weather in January. So coincidentally, just coincidentally, the Boston Molasses flood actually occurred 107 years ago today. The date was January 15th, 1919. And also, like today, it was a warm day. There was a bit of a January thaw in 1919, which contributed to the disaster. So the Great Molasses Flood of Boston is really a local event. It's not one of those that you read about in many history books. I honestly don't remember when I first heard about the Boston Molasses Flood, but I think it was after I had my PhD and I moved to Massachusetts was probably the first time I heard about it. But it is a really interesting event, although it was in one sense, like seems sort of localized, but it's also a microcosm for a lot of the social conflict, political conflict, and racism that was present in America then, and I probably shouldn't have said was, I should have said is present in America today, because, the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? So the Molasses Flood also is a microcosm for corporate greed and cost cutting, led kind of a straight line from the company being cheap to the disaster. It didn't have to happen, but it did because of corporate cost cutting. So that's the introduction, and take off from there. So here's a map that gives you an idea. The one on the left is obviously a kind of more of a faraway view of it. And the one on the right shows the flood zone. The big blue dot in the middle is approximately where the tank stood on the north end, right by, you can see the river there. About a 10-minute walk from where the Boston Garden is today. It's pretty close. The next couple of pictures, this one I actually took, I was down there in that area. If it looks funny to you, that's fine, because I'm not good at pasting two photos together to make a panorama. So if you look closely, you'll see the street lines kind of go into a corner and the clouds don't match up and whatever. But it gives you a sense of what the area looks like. This is, my back is towards Cobb Hill, and this is basically a shot going, looking east out towards the ocean and the harbor. And this next shot is approximately where the tank was, and you can see that it's a park now, and it was at least some of this area was a park in 1919 as well. And it was actually, in one sense, lucky that it burst in January, and not in the summer, because had it been summer, this area would have been probably filled with more kids and people out enjoying the day than it was. Even though it was unseasonably warm, it was still a cold January day when the disaster struck. So the North End was the original commercial district of the city of Boston. And by about the 1820s, it began to transition to more and more Irish immigrants moving in early in the 19th century, By the end of the 19th century, as we're approaching about 1900 or so, the neighborhood was changing pretty significantly. By that point, there were a lot of Italian immigrants who had moved in, and a lot of Jewish immigrants had moved in. There was a large influx of Jewish immigrants around that time. There were pogroms going on in Russia, and so a lot of American a lot of American Jews can trace their families in this country to circa 1900 when they were leaving Eastern Europe. So the influx of immigrants created a great deal of racism and xenophobia in the United States, which was part of the reason the tank ends up getting built in the North End, where there were largely Italian population living. You can see this cartoon is about circa 1900, Uncle Sam. That's supposed to be President McKinley in the background there. And you can see the people unloading off of the boat here, and I know if you're way in back or if you're watching on cable, you may not be able to read it, but the green right here says direct from the slums of Europe daily, and you can see the people are the things, I'll call them things, unloading. They all have human faces, of course, but they're mostly on rats' bodies. And the image down here, he has got mafia written on the brim of his cap. The guy next to him has a headband that says anarchist, and the third one that you can see there down in the corner, his hat says socialist across the brim. And notice that they're all carrying either knives or guns, which, given how America loves guns and is such a violent culture, I find somewhat ironic. There are more guns than people in America today, but yet these folks being here portrayed with their knives and guns. So that gives you a sense of the level of racism in the country at the time. And in fact, it was only 4 years after the Molasses disaster, 5 years after the Molasses disaster, that one of the most restrictive laws, immigration laws in American history was passed, called the National Origins Act. And it set up a quota system specifically to prevent people from Southern and Eastern Europe from getting into the country, or at least in very big numbers. So this is all kind of helping to set the stage for understanding a little bit of what was going on, why the tank ended up there, and the racism. I'll touch on that again a little bit more in today's talk, but also for those of you that are going to be here in a couple weeks when I discuss the Sacco and Vanzetti case, I will recycle just a little bit of this material because it's the same milieu, the same time frame basically as the flood, and they're caught up in a much worse way in some of the same social forces dictate kind of what happens to them a little bit later on. So, as I was saying, xenophobia, racism was very prevalent in America and contributed to the story that I'm telling today. Molasses was one of the commodities that had been traded out of Boston Harbor for centuries. If we could somehow have brought the colonists who lived in the North End in the 1600s, early 1700s, they would have recognized the molasses trade. That had been coming into Boston for, as I said, centuries. It was part of the so-called triangle trade back in colonial America, or colonial times, I should say. Colonial times for Americans, at least. And the molasses was made out of sugar that was brought up from the Caribbean to Boston. That then went to Africa. They distilled it into rum and was traded for slaves, and that's the triangle trade. So the molasses was part of that. One of the things that Boston and New England was known for was distilling the sugar into rum. Timber was another big thing. Naval stores is what the history books call it. Timber, sap, all of those things were also part of what was coming out of Boston. So molasses has a long history in Boston. By 1914, 1915, when our story really begins, molasses had another important use, which was for creation of industrial alcohol, which was used for a lot of industrial applications. But 1914, 1915, what's that? I heard somebody say it. World War I, ammunition, yeah. industrial alcohol and molasses could be used for ammunition, and estimated that the United States probably exported in the years of the war close to $1 billion a year worth of arms and ammunition. So the company that earlier I said was really guilty of malfeasance was called the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, or USIA. And it had a subsidiary based in Cambridge that was called Purity Distilling. So those are the USIA is the parent company, and Purity Distillery is the subsidiary that technically owns the tank when it goes. So USIA wants to get in on this because there's a lot of money to be made. And of course, they're in the business of making money. So they tell Purity Distillery that they should they tell Purity Distilling that they should build a tank somewhere for storage, so that it can be, the molasses can come into the port, to the storage facility, and then they were going to take it by train to where the distilling took place, which was in Cambridge. Okay, so Purity Distillery begins to look for a place. And here's one shocker, I'm sure. Nobody wants this tank in their neighborhood. Okay, right? Who wants this big thing stuck in your neighborhood? It's, I don't know, it's like, people that oppose stuff today coming into their neighborhood, whatever it might be. I don't want to, diss any corporation, but, you've all read the stories. So why do they choose the North End? Well, the North End is chosen because it's a largely Italian immigrant neighborhood. Okay, immigrants or first generation. And probably more important than that, because there were plenty of other neighborhoods in Boston that were largely immigrant at that time. In that sense, it was unique because it was Italian, but in the sense that there were a lot of immigrants there, that did not make that area necessarily that unique. One of the differences, though, is that Italian immigrants tended not to become citizens. The Italian immigrant community, and this isn't just true in Boston, this is true of Italian immigrants all over the place. In grad school, I had to read a book-length study about Italian immigrants in Buffalo, and kind of the same story. Italian immigrants tended to be very insular. They tended not to get all that involved. As opposed to, say, the Irish, who got very involved, and within a generation or two of being here, they were finding their way into civic organizations, into police forces, et cetera, et cetera. Irish became involved. So the last census done in the North End before the disaster said that there were about 30,000 Italian immigrants living in the North End, about 30,000, but only about 25% of those folks were citizens, which meant, of course, that only about 25% could vote. So this was an immigrant community that was, compared to other immigrant neighborhoods, sections of the city, they were relatively impotent to do anything because so few of them voted. Okay, so it ends up, they decide to build it on the North End. The guy put in charge of building it was a guy named Arthur Jell, Jell. And I spent a good 20 minutes scouring the internet for a picture of Jell, and I couldn't find one, so no picture of him. I did find a picture of his gravestone, but that was pretty boring, so I didn't show you that. Jell was the treasurer of Purity Distilling, based in Cambridge. He was the treasurer. He had zero knowledge of construction. This is supposed to be a zero up here, okay? Zero knowledge of construction. Didn't know anything about construction, okay? But he was put in charge. he was kind of from what I gather from the sources, he was kind of a rising star in the company, and was told, if you do well on this, Art, there might be a vice presidency available for you at the main headquarters of USIA in New York City. So you can kind of understand why he wants to succeed, not justifying, as we'll see, his faults later on. Faults, that is, in terms of the construction. And they said, oh, by the way, and this was sometime early 1915, early to spring 1915, and oh, by the way, you've got to have it up and running by the end of the year because we want to start distilling distilling molasses by the end of the year. So he gets to work immediately, and the construction of the tank is fraught with problems from the get-go. First of all, he can't find a neighborhood to put it in. Okay, that took a while. Then once he found a neighborhood, there were construction delays. Any of you that have ever done construction, from small things like having a room remodeled in your house to building a house or whatever, there are always delays, right? So there are the delays. There was some bad weather in the fall, which further delayed the whole process. There were other issues, technical issues, that just slowed the whole thing down. One of the things, though, that didn't slow this down at all was getting the plans inspected, getting the building, or getting the tank. None of that had to be inspected. There were no rules in place to have any of that inspected. Okay, there was no building code that addressed this. They poured a big slab, concrete slab, that had to be inspected. That passed fine. Okay, but the rest of the building that was going up, meaning the tank, okay, didn't have to be inspected. So with all of these delays, he says, you've got to start putting on extra crews because I've got to get this thing done by the end of calendar year 1915, because the first shipment of molasses was due to arrive right after the first of the year 1916. So the tank is completed on time in about mid-December of 1915. And here's another major foul up on the part of GEL. Okay, it's a tank that holds 2.3 million gallons of liquid, whatever that might be. It is 50 feet high by about 90 feet across. 2.3 million gallons. So GEL pumps in about 6 inches of water and says, okay, that's good. Let's drain it and get ready for the boat to unload, the ship to unload the molasses. Later on, he said, it was just too much time and too much expense to test the tank properly. And in his defense on this, there's not much to defend his actions in any of this. You can't say much to defend GEL. But in his defense on this, I will say that had they filled it with water and let it stand for a day or two, it would have been fine. They would have drained it and gone ahead anyway with it. Okay, so that test, I know I saw the faces and everybody kind of eye rolling and chuckling at that. The reality is, had he even filled it with water, it wouldn't have made much difference because it would have been okay for the 24, 48 hours that they let the water in there. One of the things that they might have seen, though, had they done that, is that the tank leaked. From the get-go, it leaked. So they, after it was leaking so much, kids would come around, neighborhood kids would come around with their little cups or their buckets or whatever, and they would sit outside the tank and, scoop up the leakage, put it in their little cup or bucket, and maybe, they're little kids, right? They're going to dip their fingers in it. What little kid doesn't like a sweet, or they're taking it home. for their mothers to use in cooking, because molasses was used in cooking way more then than it is now. This was before people started using a lot of refined sugar, so molasses was the sweetener that they used in a lot of the baking and cooking. So Gel then decides, well, here's what we'll do. We'll just paint the tank brown, because that's the color of molasses. We'll just paint it brown, and so you won't be able to see it as readily as, I don't know what color it was before, but they painted the color of molasses. So kind of reminds me of the first time I lived in a dorm room and I damaged the ceiling. And so the RA was going to come in and, check me out at the end of the year. So I took some white toothpaste and just plopped it up in the ceiling, because it was stucco, and he looked at it, it was fine. And I, got out of there without paying my $10 fine for ruining the stucco ceiling. Anyway, trust me, that was the worst thing I ever did in college. Anyway, he had it recaulked as well, but it was still leaking. It was so bad, the leaking was so bad, and people were so concerned that there was a gentleman who worked at the tank area. He was an immigrant from Puerto Rico. Guy's name was Isaac Gonzalez. And Isaac Gonzalez would lose sleep at night worrying about the tank, worrying that something was going to happen to it. And he lived a couple of miles away, and he said that sometimes he'd wake up in the middle of the night and he'd jog over to the facility, and he'd hit the taps on it basically to drain some of it into the harbor, because he was just so worried about it. Another time he went, it was rusting, and he took some flakes of the rust that were coming off. And now this takes some gumption to do this, a little bit of courage. Here's this guy, he's just basically a maintenance worker, kind of the bottom rung of the folks working at the tank. He takes the rust flecks that he's collected, gets on a train, goes out to Cambridge, and goes into Arthur Gel's office without an appointment and says, this is bad. This is not right. This is rusting. I'm really concerned about the tank. Something's going to happen. And Gel, of course, just dismissed him and never did anything about it. Fortunately for Gonzalez, he resigned in September of 1918, or quit in September of 1918, because the stress of working there was just too much for him. And in one source, it said that he enlisted in the Army when he left working at the storage tank, which says something. If going in the Army during a war is less stressful than working at the storage facility, right? So, as I said, I only read that in one source. I didn't see it in multiple sources, so it may or may not be true, but that's at least what one source said. At any rate, this takes us to the winter of 1918-1919. Clearly, the tank's got trouble. It leaks. Gonzalez is worried. Others are worried, but nothing is done. So, 1918. The war ends in November of 1918. And that, of course, means that the demand for ammunition just falls off the table in terms of demand. It basically ends. The other thing, though, that was percolating during this period, parenthetically, I only know this because earlier this week I did a talk on Theodore Roosevelt. He died right in this interval as well, early in January of 1919, just like a week before the disaster here. But the other thing that was percolating through American culture in the winter of 1918-1919 was, anybody know? I think I heard somebody say prohibition. If nobody got it, I was going to say go home and have a drink tonight and think about it. But prohibition was in the process of being ratified. And in fact, the last state ratified prohibition, or the last state needed to ratify the constitutional amendment, happened the day after the tank blew. So the anniversary would be tomorrow, when Nebraska became the 34th or 35th state, whatever it was, that was needed to get to the 2/3 to ratify the Prohibition Amendment. So now, after the war ends, USIA is no longer interested in making industrial alcohol for ammo and all of that stuff. They want to brew this into rum, or distill it into rum before Prohibition hits, try to get it into rum. So even though the war ended, the urgency that USIA felt to get this out of the tank and processed was still there. That hadn't died down. The other thing that didn't end with the war was this fear of radicals and radicalism in the United States. The war triggered, some of you may remember, what most history books call the first Red Scare of 1919. I would call it the second Red Scare in American history, but that's another story. McCarthyism being the next Red Scare in American history. And at the center of this continued fear of radicalism was the Italian community, because there was a leading anarchism is this political philosophy that basically believes that no government, everybody should just sort of get along. No government is needed. One of the main anarchists was based in Boston, and his name was Galliani. I was trying really hard not to have to look at my notes. Galliani. And his name will come up again in 2.5 weeks for Sacco and Vanzetti. His name will come up again. And there was this real fear that the anarchists were going to continue to attack American business, because not only did they oppose the war, they opposed capitalism. So the war hadn't done anything to change that. And this fear of the anarchists was not unfounded. Okay, some were saying like, oh, they're going to overthrow the country and so forth. Well, that's a little bit far-fetched. Okay, but the fear of anarchist-driven violence was very real and not just hyperbole. In 1916. There had been a threat to a USIA facility in Brooklyn, New York. Going back a little bit further, it was an anarchist who had assassinated William McKinley in 1901. An anarchist had assassinated the Empress of Austria-Hungary in 1901, 1902, somewhere early in the 20th century. There's, by the way, a TV series, I think it's on Prime, called The Empress, which is about her. If you folks are watching it, I see a few heads nodding. Sorry to give it away that she ends up getting assassinated at the end. I don't know if the series goes that far, but she ends up being assassinated. And there are other examples as well. So this fear of anarchy is not unfounded. Okay, people have, particularly businesses like the USIA and others, they have a right to be concerned because this threat of violence is really real. Okay, so the day dawns, or I should say January in 1916. And back up just a second. The ship arrives from Cuba, and they unload the ship on the night of January 12th and January 13th, 1919. They pump about 600,000 gallons of molasses into the tank, which brings its capacity, or its holding, up to around 2 million gallons. Okay, around 2 million gallons. Now, if you are like me, you probably can't envision what 2 million gallons looks like. Think of it this way. that is equivalent to about 13 high school-sized swimming pools. Okay, an average high school swimming pool, at least according to the AI engine that I used, is around 180,000 gallons. Another way of thinking about 2 million gallons is it's about 3.5 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Okay. The other thing about molasses, so not only is there a lot of it, but molasses weighs about 40% more per gallon than water, which means that a gallon of molasses weighs around 11.5 pounds. Water is about 8 pounds a gallon. So I did some math, and the weight of all of that was something like 22 million pounds of molasses in there. So the molasses is pumped in to the bottom. To unload it, that's those 600,000 gallons had to be warmed up, because molasses gets hard as it gets cold. It's not exactly like water, but it gets hard, and so the warmer it is, the more liquid molasses is. So it has to be warmed up to be pumped off the ship. Keep in mind, it is January, and it is a little bit of a January thaw, but it's still cold. And they put that 600,000 gallons at the bottom of the tank, so it's pumped in, and the cold molasses on top is pushed up. Okay. Well, then the weather gets warm, and I didn't see. Nothing that I read gave what the temperature was, but it was a January thaw, okay? Probably, not unlike today. So that, of course, just meant the fermenting process sped up even more, because now even the colder stuff is going to start to ferment a little bit, and the warmer stuff is really going to start to ferment. And of course, once it starts to ferment, those of you who have maybe made beer at one point or made wine knows that the fermentation process gives off gas, right? And if you're brewing a little thing of beer, like a 10-gallon little thing of beer, you've got a little shuttlecock on the top, and you can hear it popping as it ferments. Well, this, of course, is on a way bigger scale. And because it was winter, they closed the vent on the top of the tank. And they also only had one vent, which you can see at the top of that photo there. Yeah, I see a few heads shaking out there like this is just a disaster waiting to happen, right? And you're absolutely right. Looking back, it's like, who was in charge and where did they go to school, At any rate, January 15th, warm day, and the supervisor here gets a call from his wife, and she probably says something like, "Hey, hon, it's a nice day. Let's go for a walk in downtown Boston. You can take me out to lunch." And he said, "Oh yeah, good idea." So he's not even there. And again, in all fairness, nothing wrong with taking a long lunch, nothing wrong with doing a little window shopping. Had he been there, the disaster probably would have still occurred as it unfolded. This may have saved his life. The only thing one could say is that maybe had he been there and the warning gone out 15 minutes before it let loose, the death toll might have been less than it was. Okay, so he's not there. And about 12:30, witnesses said they heard what sounded like gunfire. Some of them said it sounded like machine gun fire, and that was the rivets starting to pop in the tank there. The tank had been constructed of 7 circular plates that were riveted together to create the cylinder of the tank. And so those rivets start to pop, and they let loose. And when they let loose, the tidal wave of molasses that didn't travel far. It didn't travel all that far, but initially it's estimated that the wall of molasses was 25 feet high. And this is maybe a 10 or 11 foot ceiling here, so maybe twice as high as the ceiling, and was moving at about 35 miles an hour. So it did a lot of damage very quickly. Okay, it dissipated pretty quickly. The flood zone itself was not huge, but as you can see in this picture with the tank superimposed on it, you can see some of the damage that it did. This is a blurry photo, so if you're looking at that thinking it's your eyes or you need to go to your optometrist, you don't. It's just not a great photo. But what you can see, even though it's not a great photo, what you can see, this is a firehouse that was pushed off of its foundation. This was firehouse number 31 in the area on the north end that was actually pushed off of its foundation. One of the people that died, in total 21 people died in this disaster. And one of them was a fireman who was on the ground floor here. And this was one of the more gut-wrenching stories to read of the survival stories, or not of the attempted rescue stories. It was that he was pinned underneath debris. And there were other guys close who were pinned also. They were talking to him, but the molasses level kept coming up, and eventually he just stopped talking because the level had risen too high, and the poor guy drowned. So that was one story of people who didn't make it. Another story was a guy that lived across the street. His name was Martin Cloherty. He lived in a house across the street from the tank with his mom and his brother and his sister. And they were all adult kids, so these aren't little kids. In fact, he owned a bar that he was trying to sell because Prohibition was coming, and he wanted to move out of the North End. And he, in fact, was going to meet with a realtor later that day to talk about selling the house and selling his bar and moving someplace else. Anyway, he was working at his bar late into the night, early morning, comes home, goes to bed. This thing lets loose about 12:30. He was still in bed, wakes up and manages to save his brother and his sister. But his mother, Bridget, was outside hanging up laundry, and she was swept away in the flood and passed away. His brother also eventually died 6 or 8 months later, and he's included in the 21 that died, even though he wasn't killed in the flood itself. He was a young man that had a lot of emotional, psychiatric illness issues, and you can imagine how traumatic this would be to survive this and lose his mother. And he was committed to an institution and died at the end of 1919, early 1920, having never really recovered his health from this disaster. You can imagine the trauma of that. So one of the heroes, though, of this disaster, there were several of them. One of them was a patrol officer, a Boston patrol officer named Fred McManus. And Officer McManus was in the area, and of course before radios and all of that to call in. And apparently police had to call in every so often to headquarters just to check in and see everything's okay and, that kind of thing, just a routine check-in. And he was on the phone with the police department when he saw the tank give way and said, you got to get people here as quickly as possible. But today we would call get the first responders here as soon as possible. So he was one hero of all of this. And that, that extra few minutes that the first responders had to get there made a difference for many people. Another hero was a train conductor, a guy named Albert Lehman. And Lehman's train was on these tracks when the flood hit it. You can see down in the corner here some of the debris down below. Luckily, his train kind of miraculously stayed upright and didn't crash down. You can imagine the disaster that would have been from 20 or 30 feet up, the elevated train coming down. So he gets over, stops his train, gets it out of immediate danger, stops his train, and runs back over the down section to stop the trains behind him from continuing. And again, imagine the disaster if an elevated commuter train hit that track at 20 or 30 miles an hour. The death toll would have been much higher than it was. So he was another hero of this, and was really lucky that no one else was killed. Some of the other heroes were sailors who were in the harbor, and this is a picture of some of the more than 100 sailors off of a ship called the USS Nantucket that was moored very close to where the disaster happened. And these guys immediately get on shore and start pulling people out of the mess that was left by all of this. So those were some of the heroes of this. So the cleanup was really incredible to have to clean this up. I'll talk about the cleanup, but I want to just take a minute to look at this paper, or photo of the newspaper. You can see it's the Boston Post. You can just barely see that. January 16th, 1919. It says 11 dead, 50 hurt. That was the first day. And a little while ago, remember I said 21 people ultimately died. And so more bodies were found, and people succumbed to injuries over the course of the next week or so, and that goes into the 21 that ended up dying. The other things, though, that I wanted to point out, also things that I've touched on that really don't have a lot to do with the flood. First of all, notice in the lower, as you're looking at it, the lower left corner, 5 states had ratified the prohibition that day. And as I said earlier, the next day, the last state ratified it. So prohibition is going into effect. And the other thing to point out is really, really easy to miss. But way down here at the very bottom right of the screen, I know those of you in back surely can't see that, but it says internal explosion was, and that's where the headline is cut off. I'm not sure what's below that. But the reason I point that out is because immediately after the explosion, the company says, immediately after the collapse, the company says, oh no, we weren't at fault. It was those damn Italian anarchists that blew it up. Okay? It was them. It wasn't our fault. We're going to blame the anarchists for this. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. Okay? So the cleanup begins. And the cleanup was incredibly difficult. As I said, the flood zone wasn't that big, but it was significant. And Molasses, of course, as we all know, and I just said it a few minutes ago, gets hard. And so what happens the night of the 15th when the sun goes down? Cools off really quickly, just like today. It's beautiful out now, but it's going to cool off really quickly when the sun goes down. And so the molasses starts to harden. And the cleanup took about 6 months before it was, bless you, about 6 months for them to get this all cleaned up. It's estimated that it took about 87,000 man-hours of work to clean it up. So again, how do you visualize 87,000 hours? Well, if you worked for a company for 38 years, 40 hours a week, you would make about 87,000 hours. So that gives you some sense of how long it took. But getting rid of the molasses was hard, really hard, because it got hard, for one thing. So they had to use saws, they had to use chisels. They would eventually be taking big blocks of it and just walking them or carting them over to the harbor and dumping them in the harbor to get rid of them. I can just hear the EPA people freaking out if the EPA existed back then. And who knows now, I'm obviously joking about that, but in all seriousness, who knows what's at the bottom of the harbor now that, was in these blocks that they never, just these big blocks, who knows what might be down there. So that obviously took a lot of time and energy. They had to pump out basements that had flooded as a result of this. And people said, and in fact, a gentleman was talking to me just before I started talking, and he had been in one of these basements in the mid-1960s and still had kind of a funky odor that someone had told him was the molasses still smelling. And that story is, you hear that story frequently. In fact, I think Puleo begins the book, his book about this, the book is called The Dark Tide. I think he begins the book talking about walking in the North End as a young man in like the 70s and someone telling him, you can smell the molasses yet. So the cleanup was also difficult because molasses got tracked all over the city as well, because people would be down there. First of all, there were, no doubt the always have to be the looky-loos that just have to go see it. So they're getting molasses on their shoes at a minimum, and then they're getting in trains or they're getting in taxis or buses or what have you. And then there are people who are actually working down there who are getting it not only in their shoes, but in their clothing, in their pockets, all over the place. And so people reported that pretty much every mode of public transportation in Boston for quite a while had a tinge of molasses to it. And people would talk about, like molasses stained seats on the bus from people who were, tracked it into the buses or trams or what have you. But that also made the rescue of the people really hard too, because as bodies were pulled out, think if you're submerged in molasses, if any of you were nurses or physicians or worked in any kind of first responder emergency situation, think of what it would be like dealing with someone who is basically covered with molasses from head to toe. And you've got to put them in a bed and then get their clothes off of them, and then all the sheets or whatever surface are covered in molasses. Their clothes are covered in molasses. They don't have plastic bags yet that they could conveniently just throw them in and get rid of them. So the cleanup was really challenging because of the challenges of molasses, cleaning up molasses. We've all been to the beach, right? And you sometimes end up like finding sand 2 weeks later in some weird place in your house, right? That, got tracked in on your shoes, your clothing or whatever. So kind of the same thing, only way worse. Immediately after the disaster, within a month, Boston orders an investigation of this, and it puts a municipal judge named, his last name was Bolster, Bolster, in charge. And Bolster finds that he blames, this is a kind of a classic example of victim blaming. He first of all blames the city, and that's with some justification because there were no laws in place that might have made the tank safer. So that's not totally unjustified. But then he also blames the city of the people of Boston for allowing that to happen. And he says that the USIA was guilty of potentially, he was not sitting as a judge, he was just making a study. So he says, yeah, they could be charged, they're potential negligence, criminal negligence or what have you there. But a grand jury refused to indict the company. So the company was not held criminally responsible for this. And here are just a couple of photos, more photos of the disaster, what it looked like. Black and white photos, so they're kind of hard to see. Can't really tell that it's molasses, but you can definitely see the debris and so forth that are strewn across the street. And the elevated train up here gives you a sense of how high that was, had one of those trains actually come down, what that would have been like. Here's another one shot underneath the L tracks. Hard to see again, I know, but it looks like a couple of sailors over here. Looks like a sailor's uniform here, and a couple of guys here look like they're sailors off of the Nantucket probably. And then one last photo of the disaster, kind of from probably from the top, probably from the L tracks. This photo was taken. I'm not sure. So no criminal action is taken, but the victims come together, about 120 victims come together and file a civil suit against USIA. And you can see it was just given the first name Dorr after one of the plaintiffs. And the guy on the right there, Hugh Ogden, was a military officer, a lawyer, and well-respected member of the Boston legal community. He was one of the many, many Americans who had a very established career and went off to fight in World War I and had just come back from the war. And he was appointed to arbitrate this civil suit. And the person who appointed him said, you know, Hugh, why don't you set aside about 6 months for these hearings? Well, it took about 5 years for the civil suit to be decided. More than 3,000 witnesses testified in this. And you can see the bullet points there, except for the money aspect of it, which I'll get to in a minute, kind of covered those other 2 bullet points in the course of the talk. So the company continues to argue that it was a bomb that blew up the facility. There's no evidence. They called one witness who said she thought she saw smoke to indicate a bomb, but nobody else in the area mentioned anything at all that would lead investigators to think that it had been a bomb. And this woman was very unreliable, apparently. One of the courtroom reporters said that if she wasn't insane, she was at least very temperamental. So not a reliable witness, and her evidence was basically ignored. The 2 other damaging things happened to the folks, the lawyers of USIA. First of all, they also called a state police officer who was supposed to be an expert in in explosives, and he had testified before Bolster a couple years earlier, the judge who had had investigated it initially, and then he said no, he didn't think it was a bomb. Didn't think there was any evidence that it was a bomb, but he gets up at the civil trial and says, yeah, it was a bomb. And of course, that just like, can you say bribery, boys and girls, or something? Not credible at all, even, and he wasn't able to point to any evidence that would, you could change your mind, of course, and say, well, yeah, since then this new evidence has come to light that leads me to believe that it was an explosion. But he couldn't come up with that. The ceiling, or the roof, I should say, dropped pretty much straight down, which is an indication that the thing just blew out, that it wasn't an explosion. And another key piece of evidence against the explosion theory was that there were no windows in the area that were broken. And if there had been an explosion, windows would have broken, okay? Some windows broke where they were hit by molasses, but nothing above like first or second story of any building had windows broken. And that would have happened had there been some sort of explosion. So the arbitrator, Ogden, after all this testimony, or the third thing I should mention is that this is when it came out that Gell, the guy who was in charge of making the tank, knew nothing about construction. And not only did he not, like the city, have anything in place, he didn't even have the wherewithal, common sense, whatever you want to call it, to take the plans to an engineer or an architect who could actually look at them and say, yes, this is feasible, or no, this is not feasible. So here's a photostat or a copy of the transcript from the trial. And just going down to the bottom, a couple of things here. Hall was one of the attorneys, And he asked Gell, do you know of any engineer employed by the company or of any architect or expert in steel construction by USIA of your own knowledge who ever visited the tank prior to the disaster? No, not to my knowledge. Okay. And up at the top, did anybody look at this before the tank was completed? Basically the same question. And again, Gell says no. Okay, so nobody had inspected the tank. The last thing to come out in the trial that was very damning to USIA was that the steel that made those 7 plates was about 10% thinner than the specs called for. And the attorney for USIA tried to argue that, oh, that's normal. If you order 1/2-inch steel, whatever it was, I don't know there was a 1/2-inch, but whatever it was, if you order a 1/2-inch, yeah, you're only going to get 3/8. That's just normal. That was his argument. It was estimated that at the time of the explosion, there was about 31,000 pounds per square inch of pressure on the inside of the tank. And the experts said that steel, that construction, about 16,000 was the max that it should have withstood. So this tank was under approximately twice as much PSI pressure than it should have been. So it was no wonder that it blew out. In the end, the company was fined. You can see, you can't see it here. Go back a slide. You can see the company was fined $628,000. Which is somewhere in the neighborhood of about $11 million today. So not very much in the overall scheme of things. It was divided between the plaintiffs. Each submitted a claim. It wasn't just evenly divided by the number of plaintiffs. Everybody submitted a claim and were given different amounts. And this doesn't sound like much money, and it's not really when you consider 21 lives lost, property damage, hundreds of people injured. But at the time, this was a pretty high settlement. If you, some of you may have heard of the Triangle Fire. Anybody heard of the Triangle Fire? That was about 15 years before this in 1911, and it killed 145 people. And the owners of the Triangle Company were also not held criminally responsible, although they seemed to me way more guilty than USIA of safety violations. And they only had to pay about $78,000 for 145 deaths. So this settlement of 628 seems small, but in the time frame in that era, it was pretty significant chunk of change taken from USIA. So the upshot, the consequences in conclusion of this. First of all, building codes were modernized and updated. And some of this happens, I mentioned the Triangle Fire intentionally here, because the same thing happens in New York. And although these disasters were a few hundred miles and 8 years apart in time, in some sense they have to be viewed in tandem, because they were both disasters that struck a chord beyond just New York or Boston. So more modern building codes were created and actually began to be more enforced. Some of those building codes or new laws included the provision that professional engineers have to sign off on these kinds of projects. And one of the sources I read said that this was the beginning of the professional engineer, or the PE designation. Some of you, if you worked as engineers in your career, maybe had that designation. But that was, at least one of the sources said that this was the start of that. More corporate accountability, you see that here just in what happened to Triangle versus what happened here in terms of the monetary payout. And lastly, over the next couple of decades, the percentage of Italian immigrants who took out U.S. citizenship rose pretty dramatically. as well. And I wouldn't argue that the Molasses flood was the only reason for that, but it was certainly one of the contributing factors to that. Now, I lied. I have one more thing to say because I skipped over a quote that I wanted to read that I didn't read. So let me read that, and then I'll turn it over for questions. This was from the Post on the 16th. So somewhere in this newspaper was this quote: "Molasses, waist deep, covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there struggled a form, whether it was an animal or a human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass showed where any life was. Horses died like so many flies on sticky fly paper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men and women, suffered likewise." There was a stable near this as well, and that's where the horses were trapped in the stable. And most of the eyewitness accounts from the night of the 15th talk about hearing a lot of gunfire as horses were being euthanized to put them out of their misery. So on that happy note, I will do my best to answer any questions that you have, and people start to trickle out too, so thank you for coming, and I hope to see you in a couple weeks when I'm back for a series, but I'll also turn it over to questions. Yeah.
Who paid for the cleanup, the citizens of Boston?
The question was who paid for the cleanup? Yes, but not completely, because like the elevated railroad company sent people. Eventually, USIA sent some people to help. So yeah, it was largely the city, but some private companies were sending workers as well. Companies that were affected by the flood zone. So mostly the city. Did you have a question?
Yes,
And,
I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
The settlement that was made, was any of that given to the city for the cleanup and the restoration and all?
No, I don't think so. No. The question was any of the 628,000, did any of that go to the city to reimburse it for cleanup, et cetera? I am not 100% sure, but I'm 99% certain that no, it didn't, because in anything I read, they were not among those that filed in that civil lawsuit. Yep, yeah.
I'm assuming he didn't make VP, but what happened to Joe?
I knew somebody was going to ask that question, and I don't know is the answer. I looked, I tried to find him online, I tried to track him down, and he just sort of disappears from the records. So if you want a project and you're coming back in a couple of weeks, if you can find more than me, please give it a shot. I don't know. Yeah, the woman here just said he changed his name. He might have, but his gravestone had gel on it. So I saw a picture of that. And yes.
I know came to the local library a few years ago and talked about this for his book.
Uh-huh.
And I walked up there afterwards, and there's a big field now. It's right next to the Coast Guard station.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a little tiny sign said it was a flood, it was the Molasses flood.
Yeah.
I was at the library last year. He said they have a bigger sign there now.
Yeah, it's still pretty small, but yeah, there is something there, which is more than there is at the Triangle Fire. They've put all the victims' names on see-through glass that you have to look up. It's kind of strange down right near Washington Square Park in New York. Yeah, there is a plaque there, though. Yeah. Yes.
As you said, fear of anarchism was rampant
Yep.
during that time. There was an explosion in the North End, the Salvatore Street police station, and there were fatalities. And I'm wondering, was that before this or after this? Could that have affected the suspicion that this was a bomb?
Okay, the question was, there was an explosion at a police station in the North End during this time frame. I don't know when that was. Yeah, it was it was either just before or just after, according to her. So then the rest of the question was, did that affect how they would have viewed Italian Americans and so forth? And the answer is yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that might have been a little bit before, because he was kicked out of the country at some point, I think right before this. So, as I said, the fear of anarchy was not unfounded. Did your hand up?
Was the tank located in the north end simply because of its proximity to the ocean?
Yeah. Well, proximity to the ocean, but also because it was a largely Italian neighborhood, nobody wanted the tank in their neighborhood. They could have gotten it into Cambridge. They could have gone up the Charles and got it to Cambridge, but Cambridge wouldn't allow it to be built. Yep.
I'm told, I don't know whether this is true or not, but I'm told the base of that tank is now underneath the ball field that's on Commercial Street in Boston.
I've heard that too, yes.
I don't know whether it's true or not.
Yeah, I've heard that. There's a plaque someplace. The ball fields would have been those pictures I showed at the start, approximately where it was. So, yeah. I don't know if the slab is still there. I don't know if that's true or not, but I've heard that also. Take a post hole digger and go out in center field and start drilling. Any other questions? Yeah.
People were drowning in the molasses, and they inhaled the molasses. How did they deal with that? Internal molasses.
The question was, how did people deal with inhaling and the molasses and so forth? The answer is that some of the people who died from pneumonia and respiratory problems brought on by exactly that. And some of them died very quickly, like within 2 or 3 days of respiratory issues because of exactly what you said, inhaling and the molasses and so forth. Yeah.
Hi, did the company survive this? And also, how long did it take the people to get their money?
The money would have taken a few more years, probably after 1925. The company survived this initially, and eventually USIA is absorbed into corporate mergers, and it disappears by World War II. All right, thank you very much, everybody.